Hello, I'm Sarah Barth, Executive Director of Sempervirens Fund. Thank you for joining us in the first of our 2024 webinar series, Under the Redwoods, in which we explore the beauty, science, artistry, history of all things Redwood related. I want to thank Sharp Investments for once again sponsoring the Under the Redwoods webinar series. They are again supporting us in 2024, so thank you to them. We're going to be talking today about watersheds. We talk about watersheds either implicitly or directly all the time at Sempervirens Fund. So much of the work we do is about protecting and preserving and restoring watersheds. I'm really delighted today that we're able to introduce you to Kellyx Nelson. She's our speaker. Kellyx has a background in environmental education. She worked earlier in her career briefly for one of our close partners, Peninsula Open Space Trust. But most importantly, from our perspective, she has for many years been the executive director of the San Mateo Resource Conservation District. And many of you may not have any idea what the Resource Conservation District is, and they are county by county, so many counties have them. And I will let Kellyx explain it to you in more detail, but let's just say they are a governmental entity that brings together private and public funding to help with natural resource management, spanning public lands, private lands, nonprofit lands. And they are an integral part of the work that we do here at Sempervirens Fund. I mean, honestly, I think they are one of the unsung heroes of the conservation world. So it's my honor and my delight to be able to highlight the San Mateo Resource Conservation District and to invite Kellyx to tell us about some of the work that they've been doing around watershed protection. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Kellyx. Welcome.
Thank you, Sarah. I really appreciate that kind introduction and the opportunity to share a little bit of our story today. And I appreciate you saying that RCDs are unsung heroes. And I always say that we're the best kept secret in local government, and I hope opportunities like this will make us be less well kept. So thank you. I'm gonna ask Burl if she wouldn't mind sharing her screen, since I've had some tech issues today, and she can share my slides that I was gonna show people. There we go. Thank you. So yeah, what I've been asked to speak to today is really about what it is to care for a watershed, stewardship of a watershed from redwoods to the sea. And I want a disclaimer here that I'm a generalist. So I'll be speaking about all these different things that go on. I'm not a hydrologist or a fisheries biologist or a forester, but a lot of our work touches on so many of these aspects, and people like this are on our team and in our partnerships. And so I'm happy to speak to how some of these come about in our work. So the next slide, please. What is an RCD? Is the next slide isn't there quite yet. Thank you. What is an RCD? I think probably a lot of you have heard of it, or maybe haven't heard of it, but what is it, what does it mean? So there are about 100 RCDs in California, a few thousand around the nation. They're in almost every county in the United States. We're forms of local government. We've been around since the Dust Bowl crisis, and our job basically is to help people help the land. We work across jurisdictions, as Sarah said, across public and private lands, across politics, at the scale that is needed to accomplish conservation. We are very much boots on the ground. Our work is not to, we don't regulate people. We don't litigate or advocate. We don't typically do much land acquisition or easement work. The niche that we're in is very much in partnership, accomplishing conservation on the ground through stewardship. And if you can advance to the next slide, thank you. In San Mateo County, where I work, what this looks like is these focal areas having to do with water resources, climate mitigation and adaptation, restoring habitat for wildlife with a particular focus on threatened and endangered species. We are really grounded in also with working lands. We were formed by farmers and ranchers. And also a lot of our work has to do with forest health and fire resilience. And what we do is provide comprehensive integrated assistance that crosses through these multiple ways of looking at landscape management. So if we go to the next slide, we'll move on now from what is an RCD or what is San Mateo RCD and talk about this concept of a watershed. What is a watershed? Wherever you are on this earth, wherever you visit, wherever you live, wherever you work, wherever you recreate, you're always in a watershed. A watershed is basically an area of land that shares a common drainage. The watershed of a pond is the land around it that drains in and fills the pond. It likely combines with other watersheds as part of a larger watershed for, say, a creek. Smaller creeks come together into larger creeks and maybe into rivers. So when you look at this map of the continental United States, you can see this is a map of the watersheds, the primary watersheds of the United States. The most significant watershed, draining about 40% of the continental US, is the Mississippi River watershed that drains out into the ocean at the bottom. And then if we go to the next slide, you can see this is obviously not unique to us in the United States. And other continents also, they're all, these lands manage how water flows across it. Humans often alter how water flows, and that's something that we'll talk about in a little bit. And so then if you go to the next slide, zooming in a little bit, these are the watersheds in San Mateo County where I work. And you can see that the Santa Cruz Mountains are like a spine down the county that serve as the watershed divide. It divides the watersheds that drain to the east, which is San Francisco Bay, and to the west, which is the ocean. And so then if we go to the next slide, we're zooming in a little bit more on what I'm going to focus on in particular today. This is the watershed for Pescadero Creek in the community of Pescadero. And it's the most significant outer coastal estuary between Elkhorn Slough to the south and Tomales Bay to the north. And I find this watershed to be a great case study in how a watershed works and sometimes doesn't work, and how people can come together to care for it from the redwoods to the sea. So the next slide is a really obvious, I think, visual representation. You know, they say a picture can tell, what is it? A picture tells 1,000 words, or I can't remember it now. That you can see how obvious it is that coastal watersheds and coastal communities have a very deep and immediate connection to the ocean and marine ecosystems. They're the front lines between what happens in the sea and what happens on the land. So if you look at the next slide, how we treat these lands, how we care for them, can have direct implications for marine life as well as terrestrial life. And then some of these animals, birds like marbled murrelets and fish like coho salmon, split their time between multiple habitats depending on both marine and terrestrial ecosystems. And if you go to the next slide, I am particularly interested in the relationship between redwoods and coho salmon. And it's interesting to me because they're not only connected geographically by a regular migration between the ocean up to these upland area, not upland, but these inland areas where they spawn and migrate. But they're not only connected geographically, but they in fact depend on each other. Redwoods are essential to providing the cool, clear streams that salmon need. They shade the water, they keep it cold and oxygen rich. Trees fall into streams, creating deep pools where fish take refuge from predators and fast currents and drought alike, and where bugs and other fish food gather. These forests also hold back sediment that would otherwise bleed into the creeks and suffocate the fish eggs. In turn, after salmon spawn and die, their carcasses supply marine-derived nutrients that work their way into the food web and redwoods and other plants. And recent scientific studies have found that around salmon-rich rivers, 40 to 80% of the nitrogen in shrubs and trees originates in the open ocean. They've tracked the isotopes on this. It's really fascinating. And some of the biggest threats to the current salmon populations in this region are not enough water flowing through rivers and streams at critical times of the year, the straightening and channelizing of channels of the creeks that causes them to cut down and disconnect from the adjacent lands that we call floodplains. And when creeks do flow out over floodplains, it's a veritable smorgasbord of insects as food and all sorts of great conditions. Now, as we humans have removed downed trees from creeks to clean them up, and we've removed complexity in these creeks, we've really altered their habitats for food and refuge. And when we've done that, it has this feedback loop then to the forests. And research has shown that dwindling salmon populations has a major impact on coastal forests, with trees growing more slowly and less large, as well as impacting other wildlife in the complex food web of the forest. So this relationship between salmon and redwoods, I just find particularly interesting in illustrating how all of these are connected. If we turn to the next slide, you'll see that along the way between the ocean and the redwoods are grasslands and scrub habitats and the creeks, the ponds, the wetlands, farms, ranches, people's backyards, are home to myriad other wildlife that need functioning ecosystems. And many are facing the threat of extinction in this area, like San Francisco garter snake, California red-legged frog, steelhead trout, and more. And the next slide is to point out that in these watersheds and in these lands are also farms, which are part of our food system and our food security. And next slide, they provide us with food, fiber, flowers, jobs, a way of life, a landscape, a bucolic landscape. There's a lot of benefits, including, next slide, that these farms and these farmers are a significant part of our community as well. So on this next slide, upper watersheds, including the headwaters of creeks and stream valleys, provide essential habitat for many species. That is true, but moreover, they provide complex ecosystem services that help upstream and downstream communities be resilient. When functioning well, they can attenuate both flooding and drought. They can minimize the risk of catastrophic erosion. They can protect water resources for drinking water, habitat, agriculture. They can contribute to local economies, recreationally and otherwise. But the converse is also true. When impaired, these lands contribute to localized flooding. They contribute to drought conditions. They contribute to erosion. They can compromise water quality. And I want to acknowledge, Sarah noted this in her introduction, that these lands were stewarded for many thousands of years before the relatively recent history. And the really accelerated impairment that we are now working to reverse is really post colonization, that there was active land management for 10 to 12,000 years by the indigenous people who lived here. And so the impacts of these watersheds are relatively recent in human history. So if we go to the next slide, this is a really good example of what happens in terms of how we manage our land, our soils, and our creeks, and how that can directly affect erosion. On the upper left, you'll see that circle. You'll see that's a person. And so that gives you a sense of scale. This gully opened up in one storm over like a 1 to 2 day period. And that's because the creek had been channelized and over time had cut down, got disconnected from its adjacent floodplain. Soils had been compromised, were more erosive, drainage had been altered, the conditions were ripe for a catastrophe. One big storm, this happens. And then not only someone losing their property, but there are impacts to the creek and to the habitat as well. And in this case, land that's taken out of agricultural production as well. And so if you proceed to the next slide, this excessive erosion and sedimentation not only causes loss of property and damaging habitat, but it can also accumulate downstream, where in this case in Pescadero, it filled a creek so that the water no longer flowed in the creek in minor storm events, and instead would flow across the land, in the roads, and cause a great deal of flooding or damage rather, and also disconnect people from emergency response, etc. And not only did it cause this flooding, but it also affected water quality and resulted in things like the regular asphyxiation of steelhead trout in large numbers, the fish that you see on the lower right. And the next slide, please. Thank you. Also, the way that we've changed the management of our land has increased the risk of fire and other natural disasters. We'll go into that in more detail. These photos here are from the August 2020 CZU Lightning Complex fires and their aftermath, which I think probably almost everybody, if not everybody in this webinar, is pretty familiar with. And then the next slide. These are just some of the photos from last winter's storms when we were contacted to provide help. You'll see debris flows that were exacerbated by fires and lost vegetation, filling a creek, taking out roads and bridges, failing dams, compromising homes and structures, compromising trees, causing hazard trees, all sorts of things. Mudslides, culverts, flooding, access and egress, impairment, septic systems that are inundated or compromised. And so there's a feedback loop where sometimes if we're not managing our watersheds well, they create situations that further impact the watershed. So next slide. Before we start on the slide, I'll explain what this is. I've mentioned a few times about floodplains. And so these previous few slides kind of paint a picture of what can go wrong if we're not managing our lands and our watersheds properly. But I want to talk a little bit now about what it is that collectively we, the RCD, and many, many partners, some of whom are in this webinar, what is it that we're doing to try to address some of these concerns? And a lot of it has to do with how we manage sediment and water. And as we straightened creeks over time, what happens is the creeks are then going faster, they're more efficient, they're kind of like a fire hose, and they cut down and become disconnected from those adjacent lands where they used to spread out. And we want to reconnect some of these creeks to floodplains wherever possible. And this is a project that we did with our partners at Peninsula Open Space Trust, where we built the bottom of the creek back up, and also cut into the banks of the creek, again, reducing some berms to help it spill out, and also put some wood and rocks back in the creek like it had been historically to create some natural messiness like it's supposed to have. And all of this slowed water down, allowed sediment to drop out, and that's and also improved habitat conditions. As we look at this this video, I'm going to ask Burl to go ahead. You can do that. Thank you. So you can see Burl, if you don't mind circling one and then a second to the right, two, and then there's one near the front of the screen also by the YouTube icon right there. So those are stakes that are in the ground that are to monitor, as we restore this floodplain, how much sediment it is in fact storing. And this time-lapse photography, this video, it's a series of basically photos during a storm event, shows you what happens when the creek fills up, spills over its banks, and watch those stakes and see what happens to them, and just know that that is sediment that is not going downstream and causing flooding. And you'll see that those stakes are largely gone. And so that is one of the many benefits. That's one of the services that's provided by floodplains. And we can go to the next slide. In general, all of these, oh, you know what, you might need to hit escape. There you go. So in general, with the sediment management, we want to build soil health, prevent erosion, manage erosion when it does happen, give sediment places to go and sort throughout the system. A lot of that has to do with reducing erosion from roads and gullies and stream banks. People have got culverts on their properties. There's all sorts of sources of that. But then also what we want to do throughout these watersheds that you see in this image is take actions with countless partners to restore migration for salmon and steelhead and other fish like Pacific lamprey as well. And so here's an example of just removing a dam, a barrier to fish migration, so that they can spawn and migrate more freely. This one project alone restored over 50 miles of access to some of the most pristine habitat in the watershed. If we look at the next slide, we talked earlier, I spoke earlier about the fact that the water in the creek is the amount, whether there's adequate water at the critical times is a significant limiting factor to survival of some of these species and their ability to migrate between the ocean and the redwoods. In much of the area that I work, particularly in the Pescadero watershed, water supply is very limited and local. There's no water utility, there's no snowpack, there's no state water project, there's no municipal reservoir, there's no irrigation district. So low stream flows threaten fish and wildlife, as well as domestic and agricultural water supply, including things like campgrounds. We've had campgrounds closed down during the drought because there wasn't water. So a lot of our work focuses on water conservation, water storage, water efficiency, changing timing of diversion, water management, etc. Next slide. Something else that can be done at really a watershed scale involves agricultural partners. Globally, the release of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases from soils and vegetation have accelerated climate change. We can build resilience in the watershed to adapt to climate change while also reducing emissions of additional greenhouse gases and reverse climate change by drawing greenhouse gases down from the atmosphere and storing them in the soils and the vegetation from which they came. And we work with numerous partners on what we call carbon farming. And if you look at the bottom photo there, that's an example of a carbon farm plan that develops very site-specific recommendations for working lands, a farm or a ranch. In this case, this is Tomcat Ranch in Pescadero, to be able to sequester as much carbon as possible. And then it turns out that doing this thing that's good for climate mitigation has other co-benefits like water storage on the land, improved habitat, reduced erosion, maybe improved forage, etc. The next slide shows that these are pretty simple practices that increase the transfer of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere to plants and soil, using these low-tech, nature-based solutions. But what's amazing about them, if you look at the next slide, is that just having completed 11 plans in San Mateo County has, when implemented, will sequester 1,400 carbon dioxide equivalent tons annually. That is the equivalent to the amount of sequestered by over 1,800 acres of US forests per year, or taking 3.5 million miles of cars off the road. And it's exciting to have a solution to mitigating climate change that is literally under our feet. And contrary to what we're often told, agriculture in this case can be part of the solution. If we look at the next slide, I want to turn our attention now to forest management itself, which is, of course, so much of what Sempervirens brings to the table is protecting forests. And so many of you that are friends of Sempervirens Fund obviously care a lot about forests and particularly redwoods. And so we partner with Sempervirens and many others to help ensure that these local forests in the Santa Cruz Mountains region are healthier, more resilient, better adapted to changing climate conditions, increased drought, increased wildfires, pest and pathogen outbreaks, less biological diversity, are threats that these forests are currently facing. We are seeing a lot of the same species with less diversity, with the same size and age, making them very vulnerable to the same stresses. And we're expecting all of these threats to increase with climate change. At the same time, in the last 175 years or so, we've drastically changed the way the forests are managed. As we talked about before, for the previous 10 to 12,000 years, Native people in this region actively managed these forests, including introducing regular low-intensity fires. And those of us who are relative newcomers to the area displaced these stewards. And over the years, we clear-cut our forests. We built communities and infrastructure in their midst. And we have also undertaken very significant efforts to control fire. And over time, we've created a disaster waiting to happen. And in 2020, it did, and more will. So not only because we've made it so that basically only catastrophic fires can happen, we've really made it so that fire is riskier. We've gotten rid of a lot of the conditions that make it possible to do the low intensity fires that Native people did regularly. But we've also jeopardized forest health and biodiversity. So there's risks to human communities and there's risks to the ecological communities as well. And so if you look at the next slide, this is an example of what some of our forest health work might look like. So for example, Douglas fir trees, in the absence of regular fire, have really exploded in their populations and in a way that is, in some cases, a monoculture. And here's an example of where the Doug fir trees were taking over a very precious remnant of an oak woodland. And so this work involved removing some of the Douglas fir trees that were out competing the oak woodland. And if you look at the next photo, or the next slide rather, oops, I think it's above that. Oh, you know, sorry, I put in two of the same slide. I'll stay there for a moment and say that I put this in here because if you look at the top right photo, you can see some of the equipment that's used, and it's jarring. Sometimes I think, particularly for many of us who have given a lot of our lives to protecting forests, to shift into this mindset that protecting forests now sometimes includes thinning them and removing trees. It is quite literally seeing the forest for the trees. And so I wanted to put something in these slides that showed actual removal of trees, although the vast majority of the work is really understory mastication that brings down the competition in the fuel loads in the understory and gets it back to the point where fire can be introduced again in a safe way that has ecological and resilience benefits. So then moving to the next slide now, and thank you, Beryl, for doing this. I wanted to know certainly where RCDs come from on this, and my personal opinion is that sustainable solutions to watershed management need to acknowledge that there are people here. People live here, people make their living here. There are businesses that depend on these lands, rural economies that depend on these lands, people who travel here to hike, bike, go camping, and balancing competing demands on very limited resources particularly depends upon people coming together and working across interests, across values, across languages, across political divides to share and restore what everyone loves and needs. A watershed is truly the connective tissue that brings something in common for everyone who depends on it. So the next slide shows what this looks like at scale. what does it look like at scale in this watershed? Is resilience. When we're doing all these projects, and these red dots are just like a sampling of projects that some partners have been doing with the RCD. At scale, what you get is resilience. If you're providing comprehensive, integrated, holistic, inclusive watershed stewardship, you get thriving wildlife and ecosystems, you mitigate natural disasters, you protect water supply and properties and agriculture, and can mitigate climate change, not just adapt to climate change. So that is a sort of a snapshot in time, just a quick overview of how at San Mateo RCD we approach watershed stewardship. Next slide is just a little bit of contact information. You could take a screen grab or a photo. And I look forward to answering any questions you might have.
Thank you, Kellyx. That was great. I'm going to start with questions from me, and then we'll leave time for questions from the audience as well. You talked a great deal about the specific watershed that you were highlighting as a case study, but I wondered if you could comment more broadly on the state of watersheds in our region and whether the majority of them are threatened. Sort of where are we at with our watersheds?
You know, we don't do that kind of assessment really at the RCD, but I mean, certainly these are altered. We do know that we've got a couple hundred years of damage to forests.
Yeah.
And
There's
I
no
think
other way of saying it.
yeah, I mean, we do. You know, we did a lot of clear cutting, and we've developed a lot in the midst of them. You know, it's not gonna reversing that or restoring is not going to happen overnight, and it's not going to necessarily be what it was, because we've also got climate change. That said, I also see that we've done a lot, and we could probably do more with protecting land in terms of protecting it from development. There's also, I think, a really important role for people in the developed areas and the people who are here and the private lands, because stopping land from being developed is part of the equation, but actively stewarding it and managing it is another part, and there's a real need for that. We've seen declines in populations of a number of species, including coho salmon at, in critical numbers. So I haven't done like an assessment of the watersheds, but we certainly are seeing issues that need to be addressed.
Yeah, and I want to probe a little deeper on this specific question of, for organizations like Sempervirens, for almost 125 years, we've been protecting the land. And it's only in more recent years that we really have gotten deeply involved in stewardship activities. It's not that we were opposed to it or didn't support it, but we ourselves have become very active stewards of our properties. And so this audience, our supporters, they've heard things like our efforts to remove dams on our property or to install large woody debris to enhance habitat for coho. And they're well aware that we prioritize things like acquisition of headwater properties. I think there's less awareness, and we are trying to educate this audience about the importance of forest management and how it is linked to some of these watershed conditions. And you touched on it, and I was especially glad that you showed that picture of that that oak woodland restoration project, because I think it can be upsetting to folks like our supporters who have, are passionate about protecting redwood forests and don't understand it when an organization like Sempervirens goes in and thins those redwood forests. And I wondered if you could just speak a little more about the connection between that kind of active forest management, actually managing the trees in ways that benefit the watershed, so people can better understand why that's essential and why organizations like Sempervirens need to not only do it on our own properties, but why we're advocating for open space measures like I talked about at the beginning of the webinar to help fund it much more broadly.
Yeah. I mean, this is part of my own evolution as well.
Yeah,
I think for a lot of us, I think a lot of us, this has been a really big, many of us, I mean, I've been working in the environmental world for years now. Like
you and me both.
maybe 30 something years.
Yeah,
And this has been a really big evolution for me. I mean, I think, I think back to when I was an undergraduate in college and I was studying environmental theory and how the conservation ethic has evolved. When Aldo Leopold was involved, it was from the perspective of a hunter, right? Which is why Ducks Unlimited, Trouts Unlimited, a lot of these groups that do really good conservation and restoration work are coming at it from that perspective.
yeah,
And, there have been sort of evolving, Teddy Roosevelt's conservation era was different from more recent land trust conservation era. And so
yeah,
we went through like an essential era of very focused on property acquisition.
yeah,
Like, that's like the emergency room, you gotta make sure that these lands don't go away.
yeah,
And then we're all like, actually, that's necessary, but not sufficient. Turns out that just because we put a fence around it doesn't mean it's protected.
yeah,
And we're looking at these forests and realizing that that not managing them is taking an action, that they are being managed because we're controlling fires, and they are being managed because we've altered the climate, and they are being managed because of pathogens that we've introduced and all this kind of thing. It's really just trying to give them a fighting chance to survive all
well,
these alterations.
yeah, I think not managing them is now part of the problem, if we were to take that path.
Absolutely,
And
I
it's
agree.
taken me a long time as well, as somebody who spent a lot of her career working on wilderness designation, which is a legal tool to basically lock land into a static, protected, untouchable almost by humans state, to realize that that was actually in some ways harmful. Has been hard and a big adjustment, but it is, and we are adapting organizationally, the community is adapting. And I think helping people like this audience understand that when the RCDs or sempervirens are thinning trees, i.e. logging them, maybe not for commercial sale, because that's not our mission or our mandate, but our thinning forests, we're doing so in part to help ensure we have healthier watersheds.
I see there are some questions in the Q&A. Should I start answering these?
I will let Matt ask them. I want to ask you one more question, which is, a lot of what needs to happen here is doing smaller projects like sempervirens is doing, or like you highlighted along Butte Creek, that the RCDs are doing with partners. But how do we get to scale, and how do we get to scale quickly enough? My guess is that your answer is going to be something along the lines of maximizing the number of partners so that we're getting all kinds of other voices, other landowners involved. But is there anything more you can say about that, and what you see that gives you hope that we can get to scale?
Yeah, I actually have a lot of hope. I'm seeing a lot of progress recently. Yes to partnerships. And furthermore, yes to collaboration. And I say that meaning something different from partnerships.
Yeah,
I think that partnerships are essential for like leveraging each other's resources and bringing different, parts to the equation. Collaboration to me is something that is particularly like emergent, having the capacity to take advantage of an opportunity or to better ourselves or our thinking. And whereas coordinating on a project might be more like task oriented, collaboration, like we see with the Santa Cruz Mountain Stewardship Network that Sempervirens Fund really created.
yeah,
That kind of thing where the process is deliberate, but the outcomes are emergent, and creating all of these relationships so that we're ready, and investing in the capacity for collaboration is really significant. I think another thing to get things done at scale is reducing the barriers to getting projects done. So right now, if you want to do a habitat restoration project, if you can somehow, whatever miracles, line everything up so that your grant funding is available in the window that your permits allow you to do work, and when the landowner will allow you to do work, and when contractors are available, and everything lines up exactly perfectly. And then you've got like 8 weeks to do the project.
Yeah,
That can be
we have the
incredibly
same
difficult.
challenge.
Yeah, that's very difficult. So the state's Cutting Green Tape initiative to reduce regulatory barriers to environmentally beneficial projects has been a real game changer. The new permitting tool for addressing forest health practices and forest treatments in the coastal zone through the Coastal Commission has been a real game changer. This enables us to upfront say, these are all the measures we're going to take to make sure that this project doesn't have unintended environmental
Yeah.
consequences, but really advance the stuff that's beneficial. It makes it more cost effective, makes it get done faster, it makes it easier for partners to do work at scale.
Yeah, and that's one of the things I see coming out of the Santa Cruz Mountain Stewardship Network is not just that we're sharing best practices or sharing equipment but that we are actually starting to design restoration projects in which there is purposeful cross-boundary project expands across multiple landowners so that you can at scale be talking about restoring a forest or restoring parts of the watershed. And you can seek grant funding as a collective and not just as individual entities, each of us having to go after grants and doing it in isolation. So I hold out a lot of hope as well.
I do too. Yeah. And the other thing is that I find that because of the amount and the quality of conversation that we're having now collaboratively, combined with a little bit more ease or simplicity around permitting, that makes it so that we can focus on the projects that are the biggest priorities, not just the ones that are the easiest to do.
Yeah.
Whereas historically, I think there was there's no way we can get that done. It's complex. So we'll do this thing that's like the low-hanging fruit in front of us.
Yeah, path of least resistance.
Yeah. Now we're going for things that have the most conservation benefit, not just that we think we could get done.
Yeah, which is amazing.
Yeah.
Well, I want to open up to our questions from the audience. I'm going to invite my colleague Matt Schaefer to because he's done some sorting of the questions and to bring them to you, Kellyx. So thank you.
Alex, thank you very much for this. It's been really eye-opening to really understand watersheds better. There are a lot of questions in the chat, and it looked like you were looking through them. I'll lead with one, but if you are interested in going through and answering some questions that really appeal to you, that'd be fun. That would be wonderful. But I did want to answer one of the first questions in the chat, which was about big basins, the Big Basin fire, the CZU fire in 2020. Or any wildfire and its impact on fish populations, in particular coho salmon. Was it a setback or was it an opportunity?
So I'm gonna start this with a disclaimer that I'm not the scientist that's been tracking those populations and can give you the ins and outs of that. I would turn to the folks from NOAA Science Center to ask that in the discrete way that it's been posed. I can say that we certainly have seen effects. Like you see accelerated sediment coming down the creeks because of this. In Pescadero watershed, there were the Kingfisher Flats hatchery that is basically a species survival initiative to grow genetically diverse coho to be able to release them into the wild. About 10,000 after the fires, about 10,000 of those fish were brought to Pescadero watershed because there were fewer places where they could go down where the fires were more intense. So yeah, I mean, I'm aware that there have been a lot of myriad impacts. The specific numbers I don't know. A next question in here is about good land management practices to slow water runoff for homeowners. And yeah, that whole slow it, sink it, spread it, store it mantra, the more people who do that, the better. You know, if you're doing that, you're also helping to protect the base flows in the creeks, meaning after the winter rains have run off, when at the driest times of the year, how much of that water is left in the creek, the more that you're improving the water storage on your property, whether it's a small property or a large piece of land, either way, it's part of the solution. So it's great for drought resilience and also for helping to attenuate flooding. There's a question here about who provides funding for RCDs. RCDs are very diverse, but one thing that we have in common pretty much is that we are extremely dependent on grants. We are a form of government, but we function like a nonprofit organization in that we rely on donors and grant funding. There are some RCDs that have a small property tax base, and some that have a little bit larger, but typically it's not very significant.
That's why some of the efforts that I mentioned at the outset, a statewide climate resilience bond and a county level parcel tax in Santa Cruz County are so important, because they would fund, they would be funding sources for some of the RCDs.
Yeah. One of these questions is about how do we make sure that the vegetation management decisions are not done in a cookie cutter way that, you know, that is harmful to water courses or bird nesting areas or species diversity. That's the question of the moment. And I think if there's sort of like, if you look at it as a spectrum, there's work that you can do that is just about reducing risk of fire. And there's work that you can do that is just about, you know, forest ecology or biodiversity. Typically, the work that you're doing that is for healthy forests also reduces catastrophic fire risk. So in our work, we're not really terribly interested in the part that is like, we wouldn't clear cut a forest to reduce and pave a forest. I mean, I'm being hyperbolic here, but you know, we wouldn't do anything like that. That's not beneficial to the forest. I know that there are others who might do that, who have a different mission from the RCD or sempervirens, but in this area, those folks who are working on this are conservation organizations. I've seen some work or projects in some other parts of the state that aren't aligned with our mission. In this area, I'm not seeing that happening. We do exhaustive, like nesting bird surveys and other biological monitoring. And if we had time and I had more photos, I could show you like the painstaking ways that every individual tree or sapling is evaluated and considered. It's also been really interesting to retrain some of the folks, the workers who are doing this work, who are used to doing work that is very much about like removing trees, and this is really focused on protecting trees, and it has a lot of implications on their workflow and retraining and workforce development. So I hope I answered that. There's a question about whether there's mountain lions in this area. Yes, there are.
They're abundant.
Yeah, there definitely are. And what their behavior is, I'm not sure how to answer what their behavior is. I mean, they're exhibiting natural behavior. They're also, interestingly enough, there's conflicts also between the mountain lions and some of the cattle ranching operations, or there's concerns in the communities. There was in Pescadero, there was a mountain lion that took someone's dog out of their home. And some people are concerned about having their kids in the backyard and at dusk. So there are a number of folks who are working on those sort of conflicts between where we have human communities and agricultural operations and wildlife. There's a question about how we partner to protect the marine life phases of salmon, you know, ocean acidification, et cetera. And then do we measure the nitrogen inputs? Oh, the question just went away. So We don't do a lot of that work directly, except in both, in San Mateo and Santa Cruz counties, down to Monterey, the RCDs and land trusts and the USDA and many others have partnered over the years to address the land-based inputs into the marine reserve that can really alter ocean conditions. And also, you know, we partner a lot with NOAA, National Marine Fisheries Service, and they've got people who are doing the sort of land-based work and the ocean-based work, but we don't do a lot of direct work on ocean conditions, except, of course, anything that we're doing to mitigate climate change is protecting ocean conditions. A question is about whether the RCD prioritizes where in a watershed to focus stewardship, or is it more opportunistic? Yes and yes. So RCDs were formed to, were locally led conservation, and we typically don't establish the priorities so much as we identify the priorities from things like species recovery plans and you know, like state and federal agencies will have different priorities. Landowners will have priorities, and they might be very different. The county will have its priorities, local coastal plan will have priorities, and we integrate those and then overlay that with where the opportunity is to do the work. But we definitely do our best to find the opportunities where the priorities are and seek the funding to get that done. And we're kind of a dog on a bone about trying to find those opportunities or get those lined up. Let's see. Are there any measures or partnerships taken place in reservoirs with sediment issues to use biomass from forest thinning to retain sediment and benefit water agencies by improving water quality? I'm not sure I'm tracking all this, but if what you're asking is, do we use the wood from thinning to manage sediment? Yes. So some of the wood, whenever possible in the forest management projects, we try to use that wood in streams or in places where it's habitat restoration, which has sediment sorting, gravel sorting, sediment management, water quality, and habitat benefits. But it's not enough. There's like really significant issues around how to manage the biomass that is coming out of these forest management projects. And the Santa Cruz Mountain Stewardship Network has a working group on that, and the governor's task force that deals with these issues is also talking about it, and so are many others.
So Kellyx, I'm mindful of the time. We clearly needed more time with you. We can take a look through together offline the remaining questions and maybe get some answers out via email.
Sounds great.
And I just want to thank you for joining us and getting us thinking in a much more focused way about water and watersheds. It continues a trend that we've been doing on these webinars, as we as an organization have been thinking more and more deeply about these issues. So thank you for joining us. Thank you to our audience for joining us. And I want to invite the audience to join us next month, when we are going to be switching gears, and we'll be joined by a mycologist, Maya Wilson, to speak about fungi and the redwood forests. Also moisture related, but somewhat different. Kellyx, I promise we will have you back to continue this conversation.
Thank you.
And thank you again to Sharp Investments for sponsoring this webinar series. And to our audience, please join us again next month as we talk about all things happening under the redwoods.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.